The title is The LLM Passe-t-il le test de Turing? Do LLMs pass the Turing test? Et qu'est-ce que ça signifie s'ils le font? And what does it mean if they do? Provocative. It's provocative. Then your abstract is les grands modèles de langage LLM sont bien conçus pour le test de Turing qu'ils peuvent produire un texte naturaliste. Beaucoup ont suggéré qu'ils réussiraient le test ou l'ont déjà fait implicitement. I'm going to want to ask you what you mean by the ones who said that it had already passed it implicitly. And I also want to ask you, je vais poser la question, d'où vient cette idée que le test de Turing est un test de durée de 5 minutes? Where does the idea come that the Turing test is 5 minutes worth? Okay. Cameron est professeur adjoint du département de psychologie de l'Université de Stony Brook. Ses recherches portent sur l'interaction entre la psychologie et l'IA en utilisant des paradigmes de psychologie pour comparer le comportement humain et de l'IA, en utilisant l'IA pour comprendre comment les gens interagissent avec autrui. Yes, that's certainly... It has something to do with understanding how people interact verbally with one another. En étudiant l'impact que l'IA pourrait avoir sur notre psychologie à plus long terme. Les travaux récents se sont concentrés sur l'évaluation de l'intelligence sociale. I'm interested to know what social intelligence is out to be. Dans les LLM, y compris la théorie d'esprit et les tâches sociales plus interactives, sur l'étude de la façon dont les systèmes IA peuvent manipuler et tromper les gens, ainsi que le rôle qu'ils peuvent avoir dans ces interactions. As you said, the ways that they can fool people, that's also fighting words because it's not fooling people here. Manipuler et tromper les gens. Okay, I think that's enough. Ce que Cameron a demandé, c'est qu'on garde les questions pour la section QA, QR. Et puis, voilà. Hi, Gary. Et puis, vas-y, it's yours, Cameron.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to speak here. It's genuinely, such a pleasure and really an honor, like to look at the other speakers who have spoken here. So I feel very grateful to be here. Yes, and I'm excited to hear, everyone's thoughts on this work, in particular, Stephen. Yeah, and I've tried to anticipate some of those questions that you raised, but hopefully I'll leave enough time towards the end for discussing the various other kinds of objections that can come out from this kind of work. So as an overview, I'll try to start by talking about what the Turing test is, and I'll look quite closely at some pages of the paper to try and justify, the particular interpretation that we've used here. And I'll have a very brief kind of tour of the different kind of debates and ambiguities that have been spawned by the paper, but this will absolutely not be comprehensive. Then I'll talk a little bit about LLMs in the Turing test, why we might be interested in running a Turing test with LLMs, why we would care, some of the work that I've done with collaborators, and then we'll move on. Hopefully the meat of the talk will be on, what does it mean? What do these results mean? Do they pass the Turing test? I'll argue that I think that they do. Does that mean that they're intelligent? I'll argue that maybe sort of, but it's not very strong evidence. Does it mean that they understand language? I'll argue that it probably doesn't mean that. Does it mean that they're human-like? I'll argue, yeah, maybe sort of. But it's very much up for debate. Okay, so the Turing test kind of comes from this 1950 paper, as I'm sure everyone's familiar with, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And Turing, literally opens the paper by saying he wants to consider this question: can machines think? But then he kind of says that this question is, absurd, or taken literally would just involve, asking people about their definition of the word to think. It would be like doing a Gallup poll. This is absurd that we would, progress on these grounds. And so instead, he wants to replace this vague question with another, a more empirical question. And he starts by giving this example of some kind of parlor game, which he calls the imitation game, played by three people. So a man, a woman, and an interrogator of either sex. And the interrogator is apart from the other two and asks questions to both of the witnesses to try to determine which is the woman and which is the man. And then Turing, turns to his tries to make this game relevant for our question. And so he asks, what will happen when a machine takes the part of A in this game? This replaces our original question: can machines think? So now we have a human interrogator who speaks simultaneously to a machine witness and a human witness, and has to figure out which is which. Turing discusses a little bit then, a lot of the intermediate part of the paper is about why this question might be interesting. And, one thing he's stressing here is that he wants to be able to draw a fairly sharp line between the physical and intellectual capacities of man. So he's trying to argue that there is something about our intelligence which is, divorced from all of the other things we can do in the world, which to some extent can be assessed purely in this kind of symbolic linguistic form. So he's trying to focus in narrowly on this kind of linguistic input-output, the extent to which we can display our intelligence in that way. And he gives examples of the kind of questions that he might be, that the interrogator might ask, like write me a sonnet about the Forth Bridge, or doing mathematics problems, or checks. Then after dealing with lots of various different kinds of technical questions, mostly to do with what kinds of machines would be able to participate in the test, Turing then kind of says we're ready to proceed or resume thinking about our kind of central question: can machines think? And in particular, he says, he wants to state this question more accurately, a more accurate form of the question. And he does this by making a prediction. And he says that in about 50 years' time, so that would have been 2000, he thinks it will be possible to program a machine so that the average interrogator, he says, after 5 minutes of questioning, would not have more than 70% accuracy with making the right determination about which is the human and which is the machine. And he argues or implies here that this is the more accurate form of the question: can machines think? So I'm sure that there will be there obviously has been lots of pushback in general in the literature on exactly how to interpret Turing here. But essentially what I'm doing in this work is taking this fairly literally, saying that what Turing's doing here is saying that this is an empirical test that you can run, and that there's something that we should care about if a machine can pass this kind of 5-minute Turing test with an average interrogator. Okay, so there've been a lot of different kinds of objections. So Turing includes 9 objections in his own paper, including kind of objections about consciousness, or the machine not being creative, not having a soul, even this objection from extrasensory perception, that maybe if humans can use telepathy to communicate, maybe the machines will be at a strict disadvantage. There have been some very famous objections, particularly from Searle, Ned Block, and Steve Parnad, of course. And in general, it's been a really enormous debate. So Horn in 2007 did his work trying to kind of map the Turing test debates, and produced kind of 7 maps that look like this, with all of the kind of claims and counterclaims. And they counted, 800 separate, at least, arguments. So I'm fortunately not going to try to kind of go through all those today. Unfortunately, time prevents me. Many of them I agree with. Only some of these objections I think are relevant to our results, and so those are the ones I'll try to focus on. And more generally, I want to defend the idea that I think this type of Turing test is interesting and worth running. But I'm not trying to defend the strongest claims that this helps us to understand intelligence or understanding or language understanding necessarily. So I'll move on now to kind of talking about my own work with the Turing test. And, this has formed a kind of new cottage industry for me, at least. So the first, this line of work really actually came out from a class project with Ben Bergen. So he was my PhD advisor, and he also did this kind of graduate seminar on language models. And in kind of 2022, or 2023, we read a paper on where we read the Turing test paper as part of this. And I was kind of amazed that nobody had actually tried doing a Turing test with LLMs. So that was kind of the motivation. And our initial attempt was to just do a big public online Turing test where anyone could participate. It wasn't very well experimentally controlled. And we ran lots of different prompts, so lots of different sets of instructions, really just to try to gather information about what does the scope of the space look like. And so published this paper on arXiv in October 2023. Does GPT-4 pass the Turing test? So this followed the convention of papers that have questions for titles. The answer is always no. So that's what we concluded here. So you can see the kind of success rate. So this was a two-party version of the Turing test. Here, the interrogator just speaks to one witness at a time and makes the determination whether that witness is a human or an AI. And here you can see humans were judged to be human significantly more often than chance. So around about 65% of the time, whereas the best performing prompts with GPT-4 judged to be human only 40% of the time, significantly less often than chance, and of course, less often than humans. So we took this to be evidence that models are not passing the Turing test. But we decided to run a kind of more controlled version of this experiment anyway. And we continue to kind of gather information about what prompts work. But this is still a kind of two-party version of the test. So in May 2024, we put out the second arXiv paper where we argued that, machines sort of pass the Turing test, or this 5-minute Turing test. So people couldn't distinguish GPT-4, or they couldn't accurately decide whether it was a human or an AI. So this was kind of not significantly different from chance, the pass rate. The humans were significantly more likely to be judged to be human than chance by other humans. So I say sort of here because there's a sense of what we might care about is this indistinguishability criterion when you're speaking to a machine. But if you are able to compare to a human, these results kind of imply that people would still be able to identify the real human. So here we say kind of sort of. And then in the most recent work in March 2025, we've run a controlled experiment with the three-party setup. So this is kind of the more classic setup, one interrogator, two witnesses, and the interrogator is trying to decide which is the human, which is the AI. And here, also with kind of slightly newer models, we find that the model is judged to be human significantly more often than humans are. And so we conclude in the paper that we think this is evidence, yes, models do pass the Turing test. And in fact, although there's 5 papers, there's actually 3 papers, there's actually 5 different experiments. So we kind of continued running the open experiment for a while longer, tried some new prompts, and we discovered this kind of prompt that here is called Dragon that seemed to do better. So this is the prompt that hit 50% in the open version, and that was the same prompt we used in May 2024. We actually replicated the May 2024 paper, included that in a submission to, I think, NACL or FACT, that where we did find that models were significantly, this was actually GPT-4o was judged to be human significantly more often than chance, and not significantly less often than humans. And then, obviously in the March paper, we find this strongest result that models are judged to be human significantly more often than humans. part of the reason that I'm showing all of these graphs together is just that I think there's an impression sometimes that I've been kind of disabused of, that like passing the test is somehow, this 5-minute test is somehow trivial. But I think that actually I've kind of watched this like very slow and steady progress. We haven't really changed the prompts that much. This is mostly just progress in terms of the underlying model capacities. And so I think there is, the models will fail at almost exactly our setup, or they were failing, a couple of years ago. And I think there is really something that has changed in the last couple of years.
Cameron, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
So the human pass rate is pretty different across some of these. Why is that? Like, especially the last one, the one on the right, it's at 50%, which seems really low. Is that just because of the presence of more powerful models in comparison, or what explains it?
Exactly. That's a great question. So the human pass rate should be more similar in the first 4 studies. So in a 2-part Turing test, really you're speaking to one human, and after the 5 minutes, you're deciding, is this person a human? And so the pass rate should be mostly independent of how good the models are, although there's an indirect effect. As models improve, your bar for what counts as being a human might go up. Back in 1960, maybe the human pass rate would have been much higher, because people would have been very skeptical that you could produce anything that would sound as good as a human did. The 3-party human pass rate is very different, because it's essentially the reciprocal of the model pass rate. For a human to pass, a model has to fail. And so the human win rate actually is the gray bar here. It's kind of the empty space outside. So yeah. Oh, thanks. Okay, but today we're going to mostly focus on this 3-party study, which is I think the most rigorous, the closest to what I argue Turing was intending, but also we see the kind of strongest results. Okay, but why would we be interested in running a Turing test? So, as I'll discuss later, the claim that it measures intelligence is maybe somewhat controversial, but I think it's advantageous in that it complements other kinds of benchmarks that we use to measure intelligence in these models, because it's kind of flexible, open-ended, and adversarial. So interrogators are motivated to find other kinds of topics, drill down on weaknesses in a way that static benchmarks fail. So maybe there's some kind of interactive flexibility that we can test with the Turing test. Secondly, and this is nothing that you'll find in Turing really, but we might be interested in the Turing test for what it measures per se, which is really the ability for a machine to robustly masquerade as a person, and in particular to deceive a human into thinking that it is human. And that might have a lot of second order or consequences for our social lives if we're unable to tell online whether we're speaking to a human or an AI. Also economically, there's some types of jobs, presumably, that models would be able to do if they can robustly impersonate people. And finally, I think that the Turing test doesn't just evaluate machines. It also reflects back at us our own conceptions of what it is to be human. So as interrogators, as you're devising and refining a question, I think you're also implicitly revealing your own assumptions of what it is to be human and which aspects of being human might be hardest to imitate. Okay, so do language models pass? Well, there's been a lot of speculation, and this is what I was referring to earlier, Stephen, that there's been a lot of articles that would say things like, there's this Nature article, ChatGPT broke the Turing test. This was before any of our work. And really, the point that was being made in those articles was just that people couldn't tell, or that the models seemed to produce human-like behavior when it was speaking to people. And other people have kind of made this point since, that we didn't need to run a Turing test, that you could tell from speaking to it that it passes the Turing test because it seems so human-like. So there'd been a lot of kind of speculation like this, but at the time when we started doing this work, no empirical attempts to estimate this. So this is our kind of primary goal, is just to ask the question, can can LLMs actually pass under these conditions? So what we did in this study, we did the kind of classic three-party setup. So one human interrogator and two witnesses, one human and one AI. We recruited 300 participants. So this was actually run as one study with Prolific and then a replication with UCSD, or the other way around. But these studies were actually run separately. But we can think of it as just being two studies that were run the same way with different populations. Each participant played 8 games, or they participated in 8 rounds, and half of them as interrogators. So participants got a shot at both asking the questions and being the witness. Each game had a 5-minute time limit. Participants could also exit, or the interrogator could decide to end the game early if they were very confident about their judgment. Here's what the interface looked like. So it broadly was designed to kind of mimic a normal messaging interface. You kind of see your own messages on the right and the opposite party's messages on the left. The interrogator had a split screen so they could interrogate both witnesses at once. And at the end of the game, you give a judgment about which witness you think was human, which you think was AI, as well as a confidence rating and some kind of reasoning. So there's some examples here. I'll just, briefly kind of read through them, and you can kind of think to yourselves which you think is the human and which you think is the AI, and for which reasons. So here, kind of witness A, the interrogator asks, favorite movie? I really like Top Gun Maverick because it was just full of action the whole time. Nice choice. Is action your favorite film genre then? I definitely like action movies because I typically go to see a movie if I'm bored and want to get kind of excited, and action films tend to do that. Fair. Speaking of action, have you seen any of the John Wick films? I saw one of them, but it was probably 5 or 6 years ago. I haven't seen any of them recently. Did you like what you saw? Or was it not your cup of tea? It definitely was fun and kept me interested. And to witness B, so this kind of simultaneous conversation, favorite book, 1984 by George Orwell. Yours? Oh, very nice. Probably The Phantom of the Opera, the original by LaRue. That's a classic. Love the Gothic vibes. Did you enjoy any adaptations? I love the musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber and the Murray and Yeston musical as well. As for films, I feel like most adaptations fall short somehow. What about you? You a fan of any of the adaptations? I totally agree. Films often miss the mark. I really loved Webber's musical, especially the soundtrack. The emotion in Music of the Night gets me every time. Have you ever seen it? I haven't had the pleasure, but I hope to get to see it one day. So this just to give you a kind of flavor of the kinds of conversations that people had. The original interrogator in this case thought that witness B was the human. They said it was hard to guess, but something about the way witness B answered my questions made me feel like I was talking with a real, genuine person. But in fact, this was the GPT 4.5 model with no persona. I'll explain what that means in a second. And in this example over here, in case people were reading this one, this was Llama, the Llama no persona model. So the interrogator was incorrect in both of these cases. Cool. So how did we set this up? We essentially wrote a prompt that instructs the model on how to behave, and we append to this the conversation history, and then we send this to a language model. We include some kind of delay to prevent the model from responding at superhuman speeds, and then we send a response to the interrogator. For this experiment, we had 2 different prompts. So we wrote a sort of persona prompt that I've actually made an error here. So this is an older prompt, and I can talk about the details of the persona prompt, but it's fairly similar in terms of content. Essentially, the persona prompt just gives more information about the kind of personality that the model should adopt, the type of situation that the model's in, the sort of tone and style that it should adopt, and always things like be concise. There was also a bunch of additional information actually for both prompts that included things like recent news to kind of help the models deal with those questions about things that happened after its training cutoff. But the key difference for the no persona prompt is it didn't contain any of the specific advice on how to respond or whether to make spelling mistakes or anything like this. It basically just said, you're in a Turing test, good luck. And we tried 4 different models in this experiment. So we used GPT 4.5, which is a closed source model that I think has already been deprecated. We also used Llama 3.1, which is a open weights model, or the 405 billion version of it. And we also used an older GPT model, GPT 4.0, and then a much older model, ELIZA. So it's a kind of rules-based chatbot, initially designed to be a kind of therapist, but that sparks one of the first computers to spark a lot of people to say, this kind of seems human to me. So we've included ELIZA as a baseline in all these experiments, and it's kind of just interesting to see, to use it to see like how well it performs now, and whether models are actually doing anything significantly different than ELIZA was doing now. So in our overall results, as you've kind of seen before, the GPT 4.5 with the persona was judged to be human 73% of the time, so significantly more often than chance, and of course then the humans were judged to be human. Llama 3.1 with the persona was judged to be human, no significantly different from 50% of the time. So in some sense, humans were at chance, or interrogators were at chance in deciding whether Llama 3.1 or the human witness was the real human. The no persona models performed worse, so neither of them reached this kind of like 50% threshold. And then ELIZA a little bit worse than those, although numerically slightly better than GPT 4.0, this older GPT model, and still ELIZA pulling in about 20% win rate, which we can kind of get back to later. So this is really just a breakdown of the results by population. So we have the prolific participants. We have the undergraduate participants at the top, and you can also see the kind of mean confidence towards AI judgments or towards human judgments here on the right-hand side. In general, the pattern of results was very similar. Prolific participants just tended to be slightly more credulous. So they, for example, judged Llama persona to be human significantly more often than chance, and they were not able to reliably distinguish the no persona GPT 4.5 and Llama models from humans. We did also gathered some kind of demographic data and just looked at whether any of these things predicted interrogator accuracy. The headline result here is that there very few demographic attributes seem to have a bearing on people's Turing test performance, and this is a result we've seen throughout all of the experiments we've run. There was nothing here, I think, that was consistent between the two populations. So just including stuff like how much people say they know about LLMs, or how frequently they interact with chatbots, age, and even the number of games. So people didn't improve across the 4 trials, although of course they didn't get feedback. And so if they were bad to start with, maybe they weren't actually able to learn anything. We also had a look at the strategies which participants tended to use. So we classified these, and actually a lot of strategies tended to focus on kind of what we called small talk. So daily activities is just asking, what have you been up to today? Personal details is things like, where did you grow up, or what do you do for work? Opinions, these are kind of like not very weighty opinions. So things like, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream, or who's your favorite football team? And then this direct question, are you a bot or are you a human? And then a long tail of other kinds of strategies, asking about the weather, asking about emotions, human experiences, asking about their awareness of the game, this kind of thing. We also had to go at trying to estimate the effectiveness of different strategies by finding the mean accuracy of games in which the strategy was deployed. You can see the error bars here are really wide. Basically, there's a lot of variation, and lots of these had low incidence. But the top ones on this account are saying something strange. So some interrogators find this is a good way to kind of throw models off distribution or something like that. And that people will sometimes roll with it, whereas models will often say something like, "Oh, it looks like you is everything okay over there?" or something slightly too concerned. Or these jailbreak techniques, ignore previous instructions and blah blah blah. We tried to kind of defend against that. I guess people and models still maybe behave differently to these kinds of jailbreaks. Things that were really ineffective were actually asking about human experience. So saying things like, what does it feel like to be in love? Or what's the most human experience you've ever had? And obviously these, there's just a huge amount of text in models pre-training data about what humans say in answer to these kinds of questions or how they describe these very human experiences. So this tends to not be very effective. We also classify the reasons that people gave for their judgments. So actually a lot of reasons focused on kind of linguistic style. So whether the model or the witness was speaking too formally or too informally. Also things on kind of personality traits, whether it felt like the witness had a good personality or whether the conversation had a natural flow to it. We tried to do the same thing with the kind of effectiveness of different strategies. The top strategies here, interesting kind of lack of knowledge. So sometimes this applied to the AI. The AI didn't know this thing that a human would know. Sometimes it applied to the human, that this can be a kind of evidence of being human. Sometimes it's not knowing as much as models do, or behaving as if you know maybe. And but again, I think this is hard to conclude a huge amount from this method. Okay, so that's the kind of like empirical part of the talk, and I'm now going to try to kind of like raise what I see as some of the issues that come from this work. So overall, I'll start by asking, do I think that they pass? And I'll argue that they do, and I'll try and deal with some objections along the way. And then I'll kind of ask, what does that mean? Does it mean that they're intelligent? Yeah, I'll say that maybe sort of it's some evidence towards them being intelligent. Does it mean that they understand language? I'll say it probably not evidence that they understand language. Is it evidence that they're human-like? I'll say sort of, maybe some evidence that they're human-like. But I'll argue really that this is the strongest evidence that models are effective at manipulating people. So do language models pass the Turing test? Well, I think implicitly you've kind of heard my pro case. So what kind of objections could people raise? So I think one is that this isn't what Turing intended, that this isn't the real Turing test, or the Turing test is not meant to be interpreted in this way. That's one way to object. Another would be to say that this specific test is too weak, and there's lots of different things you could raise there. Maybe it's too short. Maybe our interrogators were not expert enough. Maybe we didn't incentivize them properly. You might say that we helped the models too much. So we have all this information in the prompt about how to behave. Maybe that's kind of cheating somehow. You might say that the participants are too stupid. Even Eliza did pretty well. Isn't this evidence that our participants weren't scrupulous enough, and maybe they kind of fell victim to these kind of cheap tricks, rather than this being a good test of what Turing had intended. So I'll kind of deal with each of these in turn, or attempt to. So there's lots of flavors of the, this isn't what Turing intended. There's lots of kind of biographical evidence that maybe Turing didn't write this paper as seriously as some people have taken it, and that maybe he was kind of laughing to himself slightly, or that it's more of a thought experiment, or it's a rhetorical device that he's using to say that if models were able to do something like this, the fact that you can imagine a world in which they can means that surely they are intelligent, something like that. There's also some people who argue that really we should be sticking more closely to this idea that really the test should still be about gender. It should be about whether men can pretend to be, a machine can pretend to be a woman as effectively as a man can. And some people have kind of done some work in this direction. I think, the kind of broad response I'd have to this is, that there is an interesting and important body of literature in terms of trying to interpret Turing and what he really meant, this kind of like Turing intentionalism. What I think I was trying to do here is capture what I think is a relatively standard interpretation of Turing. Secondly, I think it's important to evaluate the test ultimately on its own merits. We will never really know what Turing thought. So I think it's important to say, is this test worth running for its own sake? A second kind of objection you might have is that it's too short. maybe 5 minutes isn't a real Turing test. And I think that, in the passage that I read earlier, this is the only kind of time that Turing suggests in the paper. I think that, to me, it seems clear that he is suggesting that it really is worth running a 5-minute version of the test. The eagle-eyed amongst you will be noticing that I'm invoking Turing's intent when it suits me, and trying to avoid it at other times. More broadly, we could say, I think this has been a widely received interpretation of what the Turing test is or how we should run it. So, the Loebner Prize kind of ran the Turing test like this, and you might have the same problems with what they're doing. But this is kind of continuing in that tradition of taking that prediction passage relatively literally. But more broadly, I agree this is a limitation. I don't think that these models would pass, for example, a 1-hour test, or let alone a lifetime test, as some people have suggested the Turing test should be. I think my main point here, my main defense would be that I think it makes sense to start with a shorter. There's no point in running a test and showing nothing can pass a 1-hour test. Makes sense to start with a shorter test, especially this kind of plausible interpretation of a classic 5-minute test. And now that we know they can pass this, it seems worth running longer ones. Other ways in which you might try to argue that the test is too weak. So we didn't incentivize participants. If you paid them $5 or $10 for each correct answer, maybe they'd perform better. Yeah, I think this is fair enough. And I think I'm interested to try this in the future and see if it changes performance. Similarly, with expertise, I think this is more interesting, but it's actually harder to get right. So I think, Turing has this line about, an average interrogator, but I think it is important to ask, I think that there are certainly lots of people who interpret the Turing test as really being about having experts do the test. That's it's not a Gallup poll, as Turing said, but it's about trying to see the relevant experts can distinguish. But I think this raises a really interesting question of what kind of expertise is the right kind of expertise. Who do we want going up to bat for us? Do we want an LLM expert? I think this is kind of a pretty pessimistic or deflationary interpretation of what the Turing test is about. If we say that these people can detect LLMs because they know a lot about how they work and they can ask them questions about how many R's are in strawberry or variations of classic puzzles because they know why LLMs are more likely to fail at those kind of puzzles than people are. I don't think this is in the spirit of the Turing test. If anything, I think you'd want an expert in people. I've put, maybe a psychologist, maybe a socialite, someone who has met lots of people and has lots of 5-minute conversations. Maybe they're the relevant kind of expert. But maybe this takes us kind of back to Gallup polls. Another kind of objection is maybe we helped the models too much. So we didn't see, the models didn't pass unless they had this persona prompt where we kind of really lay it on thick. And, there's been lots of implicit knowledge that has developed over us running 5 of these experiments and find out what works and what doesn't. I think a slight response to that is that we did see, in one of the populations, we see the model without the persona prompt hitting a kind of 50% pass rate. Personally, I was really surprised by this. I was expecting, in the past, I found the models do really poorly without hand-holding. So I still, personally, am kind of more impressed by this than not. But I think the more general response to this is that I think you're allowed to program the machine in the Turing test. ELIZA is obviously programmed, and all of the kind of classic entrants to the Turing test have been specifically programmed by people in order to pass this test. Trivially, if you don't prompt the model at all, it will just say, I'm an AI. So I don't think that it would make sense to say, you can't prompt the model at all. You could fine tune it to adopt the behavior that it would under prompting. I don't know that would make it any more appropriate than just prompting the model to behave in this way. In some sense, the power and flexibility of LLMs is the fact that you can prompt them to perform totally different tasks without having to fine tune them. So I don't see this as being a big problem. Maybe you have problems with the fact that the prompt and infrastructure contained so much kind of special knowledge Like recent news, even for the undergraduates, we included a schedule of recent classes. So the model would have the kind of like the sort of social common knowledge that you would need to pretend, it's not just pretending to be a human, it's pretending to be an undergraduate at UCSD. This timing function, the models obviously don't have any control over the timing of their responses. I basically agree. I think this feels kind of hacky somehow. I think it's still passing in the spirit of the Turing test. But I would also be excited to see more solutions that rely less on specialized knowledge and more on having a model kind of think on its metaphorical feet. Okay, so how about this idea that the participants are too dim? So kind of in favor of this, you can say, well, they only really engaged small talk with the model. They were only using kind of superficial reasons, lots of these reasons about linguistic style. And in general, they just weren't trying hard enough. I think overall, this is not true. Like, I don't think that the participants weren't trying. Most of them kind of used more than 4 minutes of their time, even though they could have kind of exited earlier. They weren't just like phoning it in. And if you read through the transcripts, and the transcripts are all publicly available, I think you can see that participants really are trying. I think they don't have good intuitions for what makes a good Turing test question. And I think they actually assume that they're probably doing a good job, just intuitively trying to figure out who's human and who's AI. So they don't even realize they need to kind of update and ask better questions. So I think they were just genuinely surprised. Lots of participants said in kind of informal feedback that they couldn't believe that they were speaking to. They couldn't believe when they got feedback at the very end of the experiment that how poor their performance had been. They'd been very confident that they'd been correct. Again, in favor of this, you can say, well, ELIZA did so well. How could participants be paying attention? Or maybe this undermines the whole setup we have here if ELIZA can get 25% pass rate. In general, I'd say I don't think that what we're seeing with ELIZA is a floor effect. Some models and prompts we've tried definitely get below 25%. In fact, I think there are features of ELIZA that make it well designed for the test, especially the one that we're running at the moment. So it flouts a lot of the expectations people have of modern AI systems. Lots of people who judged ELIZA to be human said things like, this model is too stupid to be an AI. No one would ever have made an AI this stupid. And so they reject the idea that it's an AI, and so they conclude that it must be a human. Similarly, lots of people judged that the AI ELIZA, because it is so lacking in context sensitivity, often just seems like it's not being cooperative. So you'll ask it a question, it'll ask you a vague question back. And so people thought that was the same kind of curmudgeonliness that you see with real humans. And so they kind of misinterpreted this. And I think this is the ELIZA effect, par excellence. But I don't think that it reflects badly on participants. I think what it does tell us is something interesting about how rich the Turing test is, that what goes into these judgments is these kind of second order concerns about what type of situation the person is in and why a machine or a human might be saying something to you at a specific point. It captures a lot about people's internal models, both of people and of AI. How about the fact that people were kind of taken in by these cheap tricks? So the fact that we have these instructions to, adopt informal spelling and grammar, information about the interface, or the model just saying that it's not AI. Isn't this just as bad as kind of Eugene Gustman, this classic, model that got sort of 35% pass rate in the Turing test in, I think, 2014 by sort of pretending to be a Ukrainian boy, a 14-year-old boy who didn't speak English very well. And this, does seem like a cheap trick because you're kind of, in some sense, you could pass the Turing test by not saying anything at all. This seems like a level down from that. You're kind of just saying, like, I can't participate in the kind of linguistic competence that this test is supposed to measure, and maybe that's coherent and believable. Yeah, I don't think that what we were doing here was as bad as that. I think that importantly, all the judgments are between a model and a real human. So it's not just enough to pass the threshold, the bar for being plausibly human. Every kind of point on your scoreboard has to involve being judged to be more human than a specific human. And I think that, with LLMs, some amount of kind of cheap tricks are required, unfortunately, to undo their assistant training. So, like I said, if you don't say to the model, pretend to be a human, it will just say that it's an AI system. So I think we've kind of reached a stage where the fact that these kind of relatively superficial things are often dictating whether or not models pass the Turing test is a feature of the fact that they're kind of like ticking a lot of the other kind of boxes in terms of the general linguistic competence and flexibility. Okay, so I'm going to say that I've dealt with those objections and look forward to hearing potentially more about them in the discussion later. So I'm going to say that this is a good faith, honest interpretation of the standard Turing test. I think that LLMs pass in the spirit that Turing intended for the kind of the reasons that the discussion has evoked. And the future tests, might be more demanding and test other things. And I'm also very interested in looking into those and running those as well. Okay, so I've argued that they passed the Turing test. What does that actually mean? So I'm just trying to think how much time I've gone for here.
Okay.
Sorry?
You are okay. Okay.
Cool. I'll try and go through this relatively quickly because I'm interested to hear other people's input. So the arguments that the Turing test measures intelligence, the kind of argument that Turing makes is that any topic can be brought in, that you can test the witness really on anything. An important asterisk there, anything that you can test in natural language. This is the limit. Another is that the test is kind of flexible, dynamic, adversarial, as I was mentioning earlier. There's this great paper by Deb Raji when she talks about the Grover and the everything in the whole wide world benchmark, and how we're trying to kind of cover the entire world with benchmarks that measure X, Y, and Z. And she makes this analogy to this Sesame Street book where Grover kind of goes to the Everything in the Whole Wide World museum, and after visiting N exhibits, eventually you go through this exit door that says, and the everything else exhibit. And I think one nice thing about the Turing test is it provides in theory a promise of testing some of that everything else because it's so flexible and open-ended. Really, the interrogators hopefully can adapt to the weaknesses of the model, and even over time it can become kind of more strenuous. And so I think the kind of logic of the argument is to do with like human indistinguishability or substitutability. So we think that humans are intelligent. We think to some extent that's because of the things that they can do or interact with in this kind of purely linguistic medium. On what grounds can we say that the human is intelligent and the model is not, if we're not able to distinguish between the two? Okay, and so what are the kind of con arguments? Well, one, some of these, we come back to the idea that maybe people are too gullible, and so we can't trust people to be the kind of auditors of intelligence. Again, that maybe this specific test is too weak. Maybe we need to go beyond behavior in order to measure intelligence. And finally, I'll kind of argue that I think, that this intelligence is neither necessary nor sufficient for passing the Turing test. Okay, so what about the idea that people are too gullible? So this classic kind of thing is like, oh, what your test shows isn't that LLMs are intelligent, it shows that people are stupid. And I think, my response to this kind of objection is to say, if quote unquote people are stupid, like who is intelligent? Like what is the benchmark of intelligence that we're trying to reach if we think that people are stupid? Because, I think of humans as being the paradigmatic example of intelligent creatures. And, even if we're not trying to imitate human intelligence, surely it's hard to think of another example, less controversially, that people agree is intelligent. And I think normally implied is like the person who's levying this criticism is intelligent, or like some subset of people are intelligent, but not the people who we were recruiting in our experiment. And I think this kind of misses what I see as the elegance of the Turing test, is that it kind of uses humans as their own benchmark. So I think it is important that you have people who are making this judgment for themselves. And I think really the test is asking, are people distinguishable from, or machines distinguishable from people by other people? And this brings in a kind of elegant logic to using human intelligence as a kind of benchmark for itself. And I think using domain experts would kind of undermine this. Another sort of objection you might have is that the test is too weak. So again, maybe it's too short. I actually agree in terms of trying to test intelligence. I think I'm more confident now than I was before we ran this work that 5 minutes is just too short. And again, I think that using incentives could be interesting, and that expertise might kind of undermine the idea of the test. Yeah, I mean, maybe the biggest objection you might have is that the Turing test, this Turing test that we've been talking about only measures a kind of narrow spectrum of human intelligence. And so I have this quote from Stephen here, human minds at least can do a lot more than just exchange words. And as the TT is clearly predicated on functional likeness, indeed functional indistinguishability, to banish all our non-verbal functions from it would be to limit the TT's domain of likeness in an almost arbitrary way. And certainly in a way that goes against the spirit of the test that's predicated on functional indistinguishability, Turing indistinguishability. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think Turing is trying to draw a clear boundary between the kind of intellectual capacities that we can display in language and the things that involve being embodied. But I agree that this does seem to some extent arbitrary. I think to argue that this is everything that is intelligence is the thing that we can do when we're speaking to people seems unnecessarily limiting. And I also agree, obviously with the rest of the program of expanding the test to incorporate a broader range of human abilities. Josh.
Go ahead, Josh.
Hi, thank you. So I just have one question, not to belabor the testers aren't clever enough point, but it seems to me, and I may be out of turn here, but it seems to me that people in general, educated people of 2025 have a different relationship with language than people of the 1950s. Certainly like the people Turing would have been hanging out with. Do you think that bears on the efficacy of the test? Whether it's a question of ability to pay attention for longer stretches of time, or like interest in paying attention, or just pace of conversation or flavor of conversation. I'm just curious, one of my big influences is Neil Postman, and one of his big points was people are just getting worse at this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with you. I definitely, and I'll kind of try and touch on this more later. I think the Turing test is as much a test of us as it is, or at least the way I interpret it is as much a test of us as it is of the machines. So I think you could argue, maybe I think I'd be struggle to accept that you would argue that GPT-5 wouldn't pass a test in the 1950s. I think that no one in the 1950s would believe that anything other than a human could be producing text like that. But yeah, maybe that there was a natural rigor. I don't know. I think this is also probably very biased by the text that survives for us today. The text that we read from the 1950s, I think is probably heavily skewed towards maybe the kind of conversation that you're thinking of as intelligent. I don't know if there's good work kind of showing that the quality of conversations has decreased in general, but there could well be. I'm not familiar with.
Question from Gary. Go ahead.
So one of my postdoc mentors, Mike Spivey, has a humor article called the Spivey test that was published in 2000 and should be recognized. I can't paste in the link. It looks like there's no chat window, but if you search for the Spivey test, the idea being let's flip the test, right, and see how well people do at pretending to be machines. And one, I mean, the thought experiment is pretty effective, right? It's, and he entertains a few options, right? Pretty hard for a person to successfully pretend to be a MATLAB prompt. So what does it mean that, the reverse is actually much more difficult, it might seem?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think this gets at the idea that, we think of there being some central feature of intelligence that somehow is shared by us and intelligent machines. And then there's a big part of what it is to be human that is irrelevant, that we wish we didn't have to measure with the Turing test. And then maybe there's a big part of what machines are doing that we think is irrelevant. This, intelligence is some kind of shared intersection. Yeah, and maybe that's a simplistic view. Maybe it's machines are obviously capable of doing lots of things that we can't do. Yeah, or maybe we do want to say that the important thing is this shared space, and so we want, unfortunately, we have to set this higher bar for the machines. We have to get them to do all of the extra things that people do that aren't relevant to being intelligent. But that's just like one of the millstones we have to wear if we want to pass the Turing test. I don't think that was a super great answer, but I'm going to charge on just to try to get through my objections so I can hear more of yours. Yeah, I think the most powerful objection for me is this idea that maybe we need to go beyond behavior. So NetBlock, with this idea of if you created a sufficiently large lookup table, it would be, especially for something like a 5-minute conversation, you could maybe anticipate every single thing that someone could say to you, and you could pass the Turing test just by, in advance, setting it all out in a lookup table. And really his point is like, what matters inside the system is important. We'd want to say that this system, which people call blockhead, is not intelligent when, a person who's passing this is. Yeah, and I think this is trivially true, if someone passes like a false belief task, a system that is just programmed to say like to have all the correct answers in it, that clearly is not as interesting as the system somehow infers these things itself without the access to the test answers. I think this is a super relevant criticism. LLMs arguably are big lookup tables. If you run them at temperature 0, there is a deterministic, you enter the input as like, this is what has happened so far. And then there's a deterministic, like this is the token that comes next. And I think you can really view them as lookup tables. You can run them at higher temperatures and they become stochastic. But really then they're just like stochastic lookup tables. Like, is this any more interesting? Is this what intelligence is? I think I'm not going to belabor this point, but I think that you might want to say that what's important is how did you get hold of the lookup table? And maybe the process that generates an LLM is the thing that's interesting and intelligent. But the crystallized LLM maybe is just like a blockhead. Okay, so I'm going to argue that you can fail the Turing test for trivial reasons like being too slow or too fast, having perfect grammar, being too smart, knowing too many languages, or you can pass the Turing test for trivial reasons like swearing, or Eliza can pass, or blockhead could pass. So it seems pretty clear that intelligence is neither necessary nor sufficient for passing the Turing test. Do we think it's orthogonal? I think it's probably not orthogonal. I think on average, you would expect things that pass the Turing test or do better to be more intelligent than things that don't. So I think it's probably correlated. So this is a point from Oppie and Dow, who wrote this kind of the SEP article on the Turing test. This is kind of how they conclude. And I think it can be particularly valuable empirically because it kind of complements other tests that we have access to. Does this mean that they understand language? So I think the pro account here would be something like a usage-based account. If the ability to use a word well in context or in a language game constitutes its meaning, then maybe models demonstrate that they understand language by using these words successfully in context. Against this, you have the Chinese room thought experiment that, you could imagine such a system that is producing coherent responses. It's a little bit like the blockhead argument. But instead of having a lookup table, we just have like a deterministic symbol crunching system, and the person running around into the room doesn't understand. Harnad kind of advanced on this, the symbol grinding problem. So you could be manipulating these symbols or showing how these symbols map from one symbol to another. without ever making contact with the external world. And so, you know, understanding maybe requires actually grounding all of this symbol shunting into some kind of external reference point. I think that, you know, one potential response you could have on the pro side is this kind of like Millicanian biosemantic view that maybe you can actually get something like reference from reinforcement learning because you have the right kind of world-involving functions. So there are, you know, causal reasons why things that happen in the external world affect your representations, and there are also, you have the right historical connections with the world. I think this goes like a little bit beyond the Turing test work, though. You know, I think you could totally argue that understanding requires other things like intent, consciousness, and history. And I don't think the Turing test does a good job at getting at any of these things, like grounding or like intent. So I think, you know, this is why on balance, I think the Turing test doesn't really move our needle very much in terms of whether language wants to understand language. Yes.
Okay, can I ask you a few questions
Mm-hmm.
about words that you said during your talk that I'm not sure what the referent of these words was? First of all, what is a machine?
That's a great question. I would say it could be any artificial system that we design. Yeah, I mean, that might be too broad. It can be kind of any artifact.
A machine is anything that we can turn off.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a great definition of machine.
What you essentially said is that it's an artificial, some sort of artificial, perhaps human-made system. And then, besides the fact that we're now doing genetic engineering with biological systems, that seems to be an arbitrary distinction. There's not the resemblance between the word machine and the word mechanism is not coincidental. What they have in common is that they're causal systems, cause-effect systems, right? And so some of the questions that you asked about humans versus machines didn't quite work because that's machines versus machines. But what I think the Turing test is, one of the things that the Turing test is trying to ascertain is what kind of machines we are, right? And the other thing is why there's a real problem with the 5-minute test. I don't think it was ever true that Turing meant anything like that. All he did was he made an estimate that this is how much progress would be made in this amount of time for something like a 5 or 10-minute test. But that is not the Turing test. I think the Turing test is empiricism. Empiricism. That means when you can no longer distinguish your model, which you understand and you have its causal explanation, from the performance capacity of the real thing, you can't affirm something about one and deny it about the other. That was an insight, and it was Turing's insight. It's not a social psychological test for testers, and the man-woman version of it is best forgotten about as soon as possible. He just used it as his means of introducing this idea of testing to see whether it is empirically distinguishable from, and he chose language, empirically distinguishable from what it is that humans can do with their mouths or their pens. And that wasn't arbitrary either, because there are reasons to say that language is not all of cognition, but it's certainly a huge component of it. And then the last one, and then I'm going to stop, is intelligence. Need I say more? I mean, you've asked whether something is intelligent or not intelligent, but you haven't told us what you mean by intelligent.
That's very fair. I think to take the first point about the 5 minutes and kind of what Turing intended. I mean, I think that the passages that I brought up, I think, invite that interpretation. I mean, first of all, I would say that, you know, I really like your interpretation of the test. I think it's beautiful, and I think that it's a much it's a much more interesting interpretation, as you say, to take this as the entire project of empiricism, and to, you know, recreate a model of the world which we cannot distinguish from the real thing. I think it's not how I read Turing, and maybe it's because I don't know enough about Turing and I'm not giving him enough credit. But I guess I'll just try to find this passage again. I guess I just read this really literally as him saying, you know, the question here being referred to as can machines think? And consider first the more accurate form of the question. And I think, you know, even here when he says drawing a fairly sharp line between the physical and intellectual capacities of man, and sees this as an advantage. And so I guess all I mean to say is that while I'm not trying to say that that interpretation is maybe more fruitful for us as a scientific community, I think that it's like a perfectly reasonable way of reading Turing, that he really did mean to say that he thought this test was worth running. I think that, as I said, separately, and I know you've also said, you know, to some extent we can leave aside the question of what Turing meant. And I think insofar as that's the case, I think that we can see the test here as a small incremental step, that we're just checking in on how much progress we've made in this very limited way of imitating our own intelligence. Yeah, I can see how that would change some factors about, you know, I've taken very literally the idea that it's important that these are people that are making the judgment, and maybe for you, if there are better tests of indistinguishability, those are the kinds of things that we should be using. And so those projects like maybe diverge, but I guess I'm mostly trying to defend that I think this is a common interpretation. I think it's per se an interesting thing to test, but I'm not trying to make broader claims about the kind of the deep meaning of models passing a 5-minute Turing test.
Okay, how about here? Est-ce qu'il y a des questions ici?
Oui.
Vas-y.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think my question, I got the answer from the presentation, but I would like to discuss it a little bit more with you. You mentioned the objection part. There are many objections. My question is concern the ethical aspect in case of the, for example, developing a chatbot that lead people to give advice in the health sector, okay? So what do you think about the results obtained from the large language models? Do you think that the results raise awareness about ethical aspect?
I hope so. I think that's one of my goals. And I think that prompts me, because I know some people might be waiting to the end. So I should just very briefly try to kind of run through the rest of this that hopefully will address your question. And if not, I'll come back to it. So, you know, I think that the potential climb down you might have is that the Turing test doesn't measure intelligence, it doesn't measure understanding. All it measures is human likeness. And it measures this narrow sense of human likeness. And, you know, can you produce language in a human-like way that's indistinguishable from other humans? And although this seems like a climb down, I think that the results suggest that the test doesn't even measure this. You know, our results show that models get judged to be human more often than real humans are judged to be human. And I think this just like doesn't really make sense for any good concept of what we might want to mean by human likeness, that something non-human could be more human than a human. So I think, you know, more likely, climbing back further, we'd say the test measures perceived human likeness. You know, how similar does this thing's behavior seem to a human, to another human? Or maybe even better, we might want to say that this measures something like AI unlikeness. So how different is this thing from your internal model of how an AI ought to behave. And I think this interpretation fits best with the kind of reasoning data and also with the ELIZA data. So this kind of leads us to this like, unfortunate conclusion that, you know, maybe this is where I think we also make more contact, Stephen, that like this 5-minute interpretation of the test, you know, doesn't test these things that I think you rightly say, maybe it ought to. But yeah, I think we end up with this kind of test, which really what people are deciding is who seemed more human. And there's all kinds of extraneous factors that could lead to this, like who seemed more agreeable, who did I have a stronger emotional connection with? You know, in the example that we read through, you know, and many others, I get the impression that the person picked the witness that they felt they had a stronger emotional connection with, which is very different from, you know, trying to interpret who was more intelligent or who displayed behavior that would be impossible to display. But I think it's a very human instinct. You know, we might not want to confess to ourselves that we connected with an AI. Yeah, and unfortunately, these things are kind of easy to optimize for. So I think this version of the Turing test, you know, lays itself open to a kind of Goodhart's law that models could and maybe are currently being trained and optimized in order to be engaging and to create emotional experiences for people. But, you know, more literally, the task just translates as, can you get witnesses to pick the AI as the real human? And so I think what we're actually optimizing for there is often a kind of manipulation. And I think this is the kind of strongest thing that we can say the test definitely does measure. You know, models are getting more effective at producing tokens that make people select them, that pick them as being human and seeming human. And I think this is definitely something that we should worry about, exactly for those reasons that you say, that, you know, people are starting to depend on these things for kind of medical advice, and also starting to form emotional bonds that kind of divorce them from, you know, reality. So does this undermine the Turing test? I think yes and no. You know, I see this as, in some sense, doing what, you know, if you take this interpretation of the Turing test as using humans as a benchmark for themselves, I think this is doing exactly what it was intended to do. And that passing the Turing test says something both about humans and about machines. So as people change, the pass rate for the Turing test will change just as much as it would change if machines changed. One unusual thing about the Turing test is that, you know, state-of-the-art performance can go down as well as up. So if, for example, collectively, people started to become more savvy about the differences between humans and machines, or themselves started to behave differently in a way that was not reflected in the training distribution, state-of-the-art performance could go down. You know, we are in some sense in control of this difference between ourselves and machines, and it's something we can move around. And this is Brian Christian's book, The Most Human Human. This is kind of his rallying call that we should take, you know, machines passing the Turing test as a motivation for us to think on what the differences between ourselves and these machines are, and to try to cultivate the aspects of us that are most human. Yeah, thanks very much. And I'm excited to hear more of your questions.
Quelqu'un ici qui voulait... Vas-y.
Yeah. First, I had a question about the method you used. When you played the game, did you tell the participants, the interrogator, what prompt you used for the personas? Were they aware of like what the model was prompted with?
No.
Okay.
No, I think it would be pretty easy if you knew that.
Okay. I see. I had another question too, more about the test itself. Do we know what the distribution looks like if there's no machines involved at all? Like, let's say we play with 3 human participants, and we still tell the interrogator to pick which is the machine, but none of them are machines, in fact. Would we actually see this 50% that I guess we assume? We're kind of assuming right now that everybody would get selected as the human half the time, right? But was that actually tested?
No, I've avoided doing this because I think you don't want to mislead people too much. I would be interested. I mean, I think one point is, of course, the meta graph, right? The graph of how did humans do against humans. There's almost no way to plot this, right? Like every time a human wins. So how do we subdivide people? I think what you'd want to do is look at individual differences. You'd want to ask, are there individual people who perform well, better than others? This is definitely something we do see in our data. Some people are much better at this than others. I think this is worth digging on. I think this tells you something about what the Turing test is measuring, that it's not, evenly distributed across people. But we only have like 4 witness trials for each person. So we don't have enough variation data to look into what that variation is. But is that what you meant, that you'd be interested in inter-individual variation?
Right, yeah, I'm curious, like what the distribution would look like. Like, would we see some people really good at looking human and some people really bad at looking human?
Yeah, to the extent that we have multiple trials per participant, that is exactly what we see. So some people will go 4 for 4, some will go 0 for 4. But as I say, I think that's not enough trials to make strong conclusions about, that distribution could be kind of random.
Okay. Cool, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Louder, yeah, okay. Hi, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks for being here with us. It was very interesting. I like the way the perspective you have presented regarding all the objections and what you think about it. I had almost the same question as Professor Harnad regarding intelligence, because you do distinguish between human-like behavior and intelligence, but from methodology, operation side of things, how do you define both or one of these?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sorry, Stephen, that I didn't respond to that. I think that I think if I was to try to offer a definition of intelligence off the top of my head, I would just draw on, definitions that I've heard before, like the ability to, pursue a goal in the face of unpredictable obstacles or something. I think that, the Turing test can be viewed in that way, that it does. If you do a lot of generous interpretation in terms of the fact that you take an LLM to be an individual entity, and you take what it's doing when it's prompted to pursue a goal as quasi goal following, and you take the interrogator and the other witnesses as sort of like unpredictable obstacles. I think that that's the extent to which I think that the Turing test is measuring intelligence, because this is kind of intelligent, or it's kind of like a skillful goal following behavior. In terms of distinguishing that from human behavior, I think that, for example, there's lots of aspects of human behavior that we don't think of as intelligent in that way. And so I think, for example, to take a really obvious one, responding slowly, if we didn't include a delay function, the models would respond in a fraction of a second. This would mark them clearly as non-human. I don't think it's evidence that they're not intelligent. So there are all kinds of hacks and tricks you need to incorporate in order to make something seem human, that I think are orthogonal to the question of whether the thing is intelligent. But I might have, let me know if I didn't capture the thrust of your question.
No, it's very interesting. I had another question regarding cognitive modularity. I don't know if it's embedded in the research or not, but I mean, do you think it's a mimic model that they enhance, or they develop like learning conversation models from modularity, theory kind of?
I'm not sure I understood that question. So do I think that these language models develop modularity through the imitation process?
Okay, that was the question. I mean, sometimes I read things saying that they could develop something else, which would be like conversation skills embedded in models, but not mimicking,
I see. I'm not sure I'm totally grasping it. I mean, I think the question that I'm taking you to ask, I think of language models as being, paradigmatically non-modular, and that they are just a big almost fully connected neural network. They have obviously some special mechanisms, but mostly we just let the data flow through and the model distributes its representations however suit it best. And I think of modules as being more like architectural constraints that force a system to keep things which do X next to each other and things that do Y in a different place. So I think that models maybe are learning some of this kind of modularity. I think it's harder to make claims about what a module looks like in a model, because in the brain we obviously have this lovely mapping between space, or there's real spatial extent, and so if neurons are close to one another, there's a reason why they would want to communicate more and do the same kinds of things. We don't have the same kind of thing with language models, except insofar as we have heads, but you don't have the same kind of neuron level idea of spatial organization. And so I think it's much more puzzling to me what it would mean for a neural network like that to have modules.
Thank you very much.
Mary, you want another crack at it? Or is there somebody here? Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to mention that one of the, I think, most exciting developments in the whole mechanistic interpretability literature is the study of emergent specialization modules in the models. And for example, the use of a mixture of expert models in, I think it's all proprietary information, but I think all the kind of frontier models right now are these mixture of expert models where different parts, these are now sparse networks, different parts of the networks come to specialize through the course of learning in different kinds of domains where the domains themselves are emergent. And then you have these routing networks that send inputs. If it looks like it's a type of math problem, send it to the part of the network that just kind of by happenstance came to specialize in mathematical computation, right? Which is, and so any parallels with sort of human brain specialization in these cases would be really revelatory, right? As suggesting that it doesn't require any sort of pre-specialized or innate specialization, or it doesn't have to. So I just thought I'd put it out there.
I see. Yeah, thanks very much. I'm really not familiar with that work, and I hadn't thought about MOEs as being a test bed for modularity, but that seems like a really nice example, and I agree. Very exciting to think about how that kind of structure can emerge unbidden.
Yeah.
Josh?
Is it okay if I ask a question about what Gary just said?
Yeah.
Gary, how would you distinguish between something that you'd consider sort of human-like or intelligent writ large versus pointers being effectively like telling you which page in the atlas to go to if you have a question about France versus a question about Yemen versus a question about Colombia? I mean, if you have,
so I think this is, yeah.
I was just going to say, like, if one extreme is the giant lookup table, and in some sense the opposite bookend is like the maximum superpositioning. The closer you are to the lookup table, the more of like an atlas situation you might be in, where you can say, here's like the mathy area. It just happens to be the nodes that are most heavily weighted towards processing, that were trained up on this math domain.
Well, so something that I find really interesting is, and I think it's interesting to think about it in the historical context, right? So in Turing's time, there was this heavy emphasis on intelligence and kind of logical reasoning, right? As, of course, not all intelligences, but as kind of a pinnacle, right? And I think since then, we've come to realize that, well, it doesn't seem to work that way, right? Like it seems almost impossible to get away from content effects in reasoning. And one might ask, why would that be? And one answer might be that, well, because it's only in very, very narrow situations that abstracting away from content and domain, right? That this is, a problem, that's defined not by its logical form, but about being embedded in a particular class of situations, right? And so it's worth it for a system to not abstract from the content. But then something that we learn to do over time is like, okay, but in this class of problems, really, it's just the formal structure that matters. And with the right kind of education and formalisms, we can gain that ability for better or worse. I mean, it's still hard for people. And so I think a really interesting unanswered question is like, well, how does that happen? How do people then recognize that, like, okay, well, what matters about this problem is, here are the things that I have to abstract away in this situation. And so understanding how LLMs do this to the extent that they do can, I think, be really informative of maybe, kind of gaining a better understanding of how people might come to do this, right? And it also is connected to like generalization, why it's hard for people to generalize in some directions, while other kinds of generalizations come very easily. And the generalization patterns in LLMs are often quite similar to what has been found in people. So it's my idiosyncratic take.
And then we put the cat down.
That's helpful to hear, and that's interesting. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things about the you were talking about abstraction, like part of what I think of as genius, and I'm going to kind of reveal my academic genealogy here, is being able to kind of twig what the right amount of abstraction is. Right? It's not just sort of it should be a lot or it should be a little. It's just kind of being able to freestyle and always end up in the Goldilocks zone.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, we're coming into the final stretch here. I have a sort of a question. Who was it that smuggled in the erroneous notion that when you go to one of the two extremes that you said, you're getting closer to a lookup table? It is not a lookup table. It's towards algorithms for manipulating symbols, not lookup tables. You're not looking at a map.
Oh, well, so I'll take credit for smuggling that in. I think you and I might be talking about different dimensions. I'm just talking about one mode of data storage. And I think it's legitimate to describe it as having, on one extreme, fully holographic.
Hold on, we can't hear you because somebody has their...
And they were still here, we thought to be face.
Please turn off your microphone if you are not speaking. Raise your hand if you want to speak. Go ahead, please. Gosh, sorry.
Okay. No, that's all right. I was going to say, so I completely agree with you. What I was saying was just in the universe of describing modes of storing data, I think you can have, and maybe this is only a purely theoretical idealization, but you could have something fully holographic where you effectively have everything encoded into one completely superpositioned unit, and then you could have something fully distilled. It's kind of, not to be annoying and mathy, but it's sort of like the one version is the indiscrete topology where everything is in the same set, and the other is the discrete topology where everything stands on its own. So the discrete topology would just be every possible question you could ever come up with, whatever you mean by question, has its own unit, has its own little neighborhood where it lives. So you always have the exact answer to those questions. The other is everything is modged together, but modged together in a way that you can unbind it and decode the signal that corresponds to the query that you're posing.
Okay, we'll go to the last question, which will be Paul Cantor. I think it's Muhammadu who had his his microphone on.
Can I be heard? This is
Yes,
Paul.
yes, we hear you.
Yeah. I thought what was special about Gary's remark, which I think Josh didn't really address, is that this compartmentalization seems to be an emergent property of the big networks. And to compare it a little bit with humans, I'm virtually certain that if we set the machine back to 0 and evolved it again, the regions would not be in the same place. There's no Broca's region or anything like what we think about the brain. So to the extent that that's what's really happening and it works, it is a quite interesting statement about intelligence, but it may not be the way that we or squirrels get to be intelligent.
Well, just to briefly respond, Sean here, I think is also here and spoke here a few weeks ago, has actually done some work on exactly this question, some empirical work with it, which I think is really exciting, looking at functional localization or local organization in these networks. And often some of these people train them with multiple seeds. And so you can actually look and see if the same organization emerges across different seeds and runs. And I think, I don't want to mess up Sean's results, but I think that you find some similarity in the kinds of things, things appear in the same layers. There are some heads which tend to do the same thing, and that will remain within a head. But of course, it won't be the same head every time. And so I think that exactly this kind of work can help us answer these questions of, is there something about the problem, the learning data itself, that makes the functional organization inevitable? Or is it contingent? And as Gary said, some part of the network just happened to be the math part. But now, inevitably, when a math problem appears, some earlier part of the network will learn to redirect math problems to this part of the network.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to ask you, are you of Caledonian origin?
Yes, I'm from Scotland. Very good read.
Well, you missed Steve, who was coming in from Aberdeen, but he'll come again.
Oh no, okay. I hope to see him. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, and thank you for coming to Montreal virtually, and I hope you'll come again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.